afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our Tea Corner, our monthly appointment to have a conversation on sustainability, always drinking a cup of tea, rigorously. And I start immediately because we don't have a lot of time, as usual. I'm very happy to have Rob Schuwerk with us. I hope, Rob, that I pronounced your name correctly. And we have a very interesting topic today because the conversation with Rob will be on the global registry of fossil fuel, bringing transparency to global fossil fuel production. So we are fully aware about the need of the transition for climate change, and we know that the fossil fuel is playing a big role in the past. Then we need to understand how is the situation now, and also to have more transparency on the availability, the peak of oil production, all these kind of aspects in connection with the fossil fuel sector. But I don't want to spend more time. So Rob, the floor is yours for your introduction to the topic.
Great, Daniela. Thank you very much for having me here at the Tea Corner today. I'm glad to be able to have some time to talk about the Global Registry of Fossil Fuels. Let me start by just explaining why we're focused on having a Global Registry of Fossil Fuels. And I'd like to start with a basic metaphor, which is the tragedy of the commons. And the tragedy of the commons is, if you can imagine, in old sheep herding villages, there would be a green where the sheep could go graze and eat all the grass. If you don't regulate it, it's going to be overused. And that's the situation that we have today with fossil fuels. We have individual countries and companies that work with them and for them developing fossil fuels, and the result is more production and therefore more emissions than we can safely have on the planet. And the way to deal with this is to be able to understand where production is happening and what the implications of the overproduction and overdevelopment of fossil fuels is and will. So what we know today is that we're on a trajectory that's unsustainable. And we know that if we look at production from the existing set of developed projects of coal, oil, and gas, we're going to far exceed what scientists say is the carbon budget that we need to meet. But for us to actually address this problem, we've got to think about it not just globally, but also at the level at which decisions are being made. And that level is the level of the field that's being selected either for exploration or development or ultimately production. So we need information at the level of the field. And so the Global Registry of Fossil Fuels is an attempt to put that together. The Global Registry of Fossil Fuels contains information at a macro level and also at a field level. And one of the things in our first iteration of the registry that we've noticed is that right now there's not a lot of information out at the field level for governments, policymakers, and those interested in getting governments and policymakers to act, to be able to pinpoint, okay, here are the issues, here are the places that we've got excess production. So the Global Registry of Fossil Fuels collects all the information that's available in the public domain to be able to set a baseline, policymakers, governments, and activists to be able to introduce these considerations. What do we collect? We collect information on global production. We collect information on the reserves, which are considered the fossil fuel resources in place that are economically producible and geologically producible, okay? And we compare that information to a range of scenarios that forecasters have put out in terms of what will be produced in order to identify where we have more fossil fuels, for example, than we would need. And of course, this doesn't even take into account fields that have not yet begun to produce, so fields that are in exploration stage, nor does it account for new licenses that governments continue to offer for future production. I could go a little bit further, but maybe I could stop there, Daniela, because I know we could get into a conversation about this.
Yes, thank you. Very, very. Maybe later could be also useful to see if you have any graphs or the possibility to see in the
Yes.
report some figure. But one point you mentioned the reserve, the availability of the oil, and also the cost of energy to collect the oil in different area. So at the same time, we saw that just maybe in a few days, UNEP will present the report in terms of the gap for the Paris Agreement targets. We know that we need to leave a lot of oil under the soil. So may you have some reaction, some feedback in this direction?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely the case that we're going to have to leave some of it in the ground. And the question is really how are we going to make those decisions? So, the Paris Agreement is all about reducing fossil fuel consumption, but there's very little discussion of the production of fossil fuels, which is really the root cause. There's lots on the consumption side, but we also need to think about the supply of fossil fuels. And what we're trying to do is provide the parameters for that. So one of the things the registry does, for example, is it looks at the emissions intensity of different sources of fossil fuel. There's lots of rationales one could apply as to which project should go ahead and which should stop. The registry intends to be policy neutral, but still provide the that would allow policymakers to make choices around this. So, for example, with emissions intensity, you may say, well, these fields are much more emissions intensive. We should reduce production from first. But there are also equitable considerations. So some of the information we have from the registry and used other data sources to compare, for example, the tax take or the amount of money that individual governments earn from the production of fossil fuels, recognizing that countries are highly dependent still on fossil fuel production, to show where for example, it would be more costly for one government or another to cease production. The point is not for the registry to make these choices, but to allow that information so the governments can begin to discuss how to wind down fossil fuels, because it's absolutely the case at the highest level that we're going to have to reduce the supply of these fossil fuels.
Yeah, I don't know if somebody has a specific question to Rob. Please open your microphone, raise your hand, because the conversation is more than welcome. On the while, I don't see any hand at the moment on the screen. Yes, I have on the while another question for you, Rob, because you mentioned that the registry is based on the available information. Yes. But correct me if I'm wrong, but there are some countries, maybe Middle East countries, where maybe the information is not so public available, or some important producer of oil where it's not easy to collect information. So how you manage these kind of difficulties?
Yeah, sure. That's a great point. So the first thing I want to say is that almost all fossil fuel production globally comes from a partnership between public and private. And that generally means, I mean, there are some exceptions. The United States is one exception where there are mineral rights are often owned by private parties rather than the government, but even there, the government owns a substantial amount of the mineral rights. And so parties must go to the government to negotiate. But in almost everywhere else in the world, the mineral rights are owned by the government. And this means that the government has some control and oversight over the development and production of fossil fuels. And they also have access to information on production because they need that to make sure that they're being properly paid their royalties. And often on geologic information, seismic studies that show the volume of recoverable reserves or resources that are there in place. So governments have access to a lot of this information, but they varying degrees, they provide this information to the public. And what we do see as a general pattern is that some of the largest fields in the world are what we call informationally dark. So they are, they produce the biggest volumes of fossil fuels, yet we have the least amount of data on those fields. What we've done in the registry is to identify, for example, I think the 20 biggest fields that we have in the registry, all of them are what we are calling informationally dark. So we have some basic information that we've collected, through individual accounts, but it's not in any structured data set. And we may have one or two pieces of information about the field rather than a long history of production or a long history of reserves estimates from those fields. We've done the best we can, but part of what the registry is doing is also to set up a framework for governments to be able to improve the quality of information that's in the public domain, so that we can have a clearer picture of what is needed. So a big push for the registry right now is actually going out to governments and seeking improved information. And I can say, after the launch in September of the registry, we did have one government reach out and provide some additional data to us. So this is just a start. We've got a long way to go, but we're hopeful that that feedback process will continue.
So when you say dark information, dark situation, it also means that maybe the data in terms of the oil available is partially missing. And so may you have an estimation, your feeling maybe on the percentage of missing oil in the registry?
Yeah, like what amount of oil is missing?
Yes.
Something like that. Yeah. So I would say we are only looking at fields that are currently producing today. And we have somewhere half at field level. Okay. If you look at country level, we have coverage over 90% for oil. But if you look at field level, we're more down to just below 50%.
Okay.
So a substantial volume is very sparse data that we have. So we know that there is quite a bit out there that we could, quite a bit of room for improvement, I should say.
Yes, but obviously this is a starting point, because as you mentioned before, it's the first time that with this kind of available information in a single point, in single document, and for sure improvement is needed in the future. So it's fully understandable. And you also mentioned another point, that in some cases, in the majority of the case, the field is a partnership between public and private. Yes. This implies there is also the problem of the subsidies to support the production of oil. And this go in the direction of, the different level of subsidies between renewable energy and fossil oil. So did you have any updated information in this direction?
Yeah, well, this is a great question. So one of the things we did when we structured the registry was to make it adaptable to the questions that people actually have about fossil fuels. And so we have not produced a lot of information on subsidies as they exist globally in relation to fossil fuels yet. But it's one of the places that, because we've created a relational database, to the extent there are new data sets available, we can begin to pull those in and tie them to individual projects around the globe. The closest we have to what you're saying doesn't directly tackle subsidies, but indirectly addresses some of the subsidy issue by looking at how much money different governments earn from the production of fossil fuels, although we express it in terms of emissions, in their countries. And what we see is a very wide range. So, for example, Iraq is something like $100 a ton. The United Kingdom, a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, whereas in the UK it's something under $10 a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. So there's a pretty wide range there. We don't make policy recommendations, but you could imagine a situation where, in some cases, it may be better to pay governments to not produce fossil fuels, given how little they earn from these emissions.
Yes, so in some way you're saying that the registry will also improve the quality of the information on the subsidies in the future, because you say that indirectly is a way of to give a more facility, to simplify the collection of information for this kind of analysis.
That's exactly right. And I can give you another example as well. So it's not the presence of the subsidies, but it's also the evolving nature of carbon prices or methane prices and taxes. So one of the things that we looked at after the recent Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, which provides a lot of money for renewable energy, but it also introduces a tax on methane for those who emit more than 25,000 tons of methane annually, starting in 2024. And that
But
tax,
sorry
yes.
if I interrupt you, is a carbon tax directly on the emission? Is it direct payment on the emission, or?
Yes, it will. It doesn't start until 2024, but it will be a tax on methane.
Tax, okay.
On methane emissions, and it will be beginning, I believe, at $900 a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent on methane. So it's quite substantial.
$100.
Yes, it's just on the methane, not on CO2, and it's on the emissions from the production of the fossil fuels.
But huge number, huge figure.
Yes, it will be billions of dollars in liability now. And so what that means is a couple of things. I mean, first is that means it's very important to understand how much is being emitted actually at field level, because averages will not suffice, because some actors will seek to really reduce their methane emissions to avoid the tax, and others will not. So we'll need to see, much greater detailed information coming from producers and those who regulate those producers, able to understand that link. But as a first order, looking just across the information we have available today, we can see this is going to be billions of dollars in liability. And that's something that not only governments need to know about, but also those who invest in these fossil fuels need to understand, because some companies could be quite substantially impacted by this tax.
Yeah. Sorry, I start to speak, but I really always would like to have some other join the conversation. But okay, Willie, welcome, Willie.
Thank you, Swede, amongst all you others. Coming back to that methane, some scientists claims, so it makes sense what you're saying. Some scientists claims that the way we calculate carbon dioxide equivalents actually underestimates the impact from methane, because they calculate over 10 years, 100 years or so, but and methane stay much shorter in the atmosphere, but its immediate impact in the beginning is much higher, and that is kind of missed in the more standardized way we calculate today. So in that sense, it will make sense to have a high tax on methane. So what's your view on that?
Yeah, well, I would agree with that. What you will see is almost every major, whether it's a government or a private party, looks at the global warming potential of methane over a 100-year time frame. And I think there's a lot of discussion that really it should be a 20-year time frame. And that increases the global warming potential of methane substantially. So if you look in the registry, we actually factor the methane emissions based on both the 20-year time frame and the 100-year time frame. And you can simply switch between the two when you're looking at emissions for any given country or project, and you can see what the impact is of switching to the 20-year global warming potential. It's just as easy as a drop-down menu on our site, because we believe people are eventually going to be moving to that 20-year time frame.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any further question? You mentioned that at the moment the policy are more in direction of the use of the oil, not on the production of oil.
Yes.
And but we also saw that in the COP26 in Glasgow, there was a couple of program beyond oil, if I'm not wrong, and the other one was a methane pledge. No, there was a maybe
Yes.
more in direction of the production, or I'm wrong?
Yes. No, I think you're right. You know, I mean, when I say that it has been focused on the sort of consumption and demand side, not the supply production side, I think that's historically true. But you're very right that we've seen like the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, BOGA. We've seen the International Methane Observatory, IMEO, you know, look really at supply side and production side issues. So there is some trend to go back to really what the source of the problem is, which is our continued production of fossil fuels without consideration of the global carbon budget. So we very much welcome those changes, and this is another tool, if you will, in being able to address the production side.
Is it possible to have an overview on the registry, if you may share your screen?
Yes,
at least to have a general understanding, not to go in deep, because obviously we don't have time. But
I would love to do that, and I'm on a new computer, unfortunately, and it is not letting me share screen. Can I could I put something in the chat so that you could share it?
Okay, because there is the green button on the bottom side. On the bottom part of Zoom, there is a green button. You may share directly.
Yes, I'm going to try. Let me see if I can do this. Let's see. It's a setting within my computer that has not been fixed is the problem.
Okay.
Yeah, no, sorry about that. But if you put it up, I can walk you through it, and I've just shared it to everyone.
Okay. I do it. And,
yeah, sorry about that.
That's fine.
Yeah.
So I have to accept. Then we have to go.
Good. Okay, good. So here's the global registry of fossil fuels. If you click on Explore Data, we can start getting into some of the information that's here.
Okay.
Okay. So let's go ahead and pick a country. Let's pick let's start with let's see, United States or United Kingdom. That's fine.
Okay.
That's fine. Let's go with United Kingdom. So you can see here on the United Kingdom, at the top we have emissions that you can select, either combustion and pre-combustion, or you can disaggregate the two. Most people are probably used to scope 1, 2, and 3. We can't do scope 1, 2, and 3 because we're focused on the fossil fuels themselves and through their full life cycle. Scope 1, 2, and 3 relate to corporate boundaries, so those who are consuming the fossil fuels, and that doesn't really work in terms of what data is available on these. It shows kind of the focus that we've had historically on the demand side rather than on the production side. So combustion is just from the use of the fuel, and pre-combustion is everything else. The better data we have, the more we'll be able to break down the different parts of the supply chain, but this is where we sit. So if you scroll down a little bit, you can see the snapshot from the country. We just scroll the screen down.
Okay.
Okay. Yes. And so this is looking at annual emissions from the country. Okay. So you've got total emissions. In almost every case, we express everything in terms of carbon dioxide equivalent.
Sorry, this total emission is in connection with the use of the oil, or the total emission of the country?
This is total emissions of the country for all three fossil fuels. Okay. And then you've got basic production information for oil, gas, and coal. Obviously, much more oil and some gas from the United Kingdom, far less coal today. Now, if we go down further, so you could see here, warming potential in that box. That's if you assume methane is global warming potential of 100. But if you switch to 20, you'll see, you increase, just under 10%, the total emission from the country. So that's pretty substantial when all you're doing is just changing how you factor methane. we have a number of data sources. So here we're looking at the Energy Information Agency from the United States. You could also instead select BP or OPEC, any of these, and you'll have different estimates. What this shows is the level of uncertainty that exists in the actual emissions estimates that are out there, as we're trying to be both policy neutral and also neutral to the data source. We're giving you the full range, okay? And then there's also a range of uncertainty, and that's expressed there with a P5 to P95 interval. So what that means is, you know, between the 5% and 95% probability, that's the range, and with the median line in the black dotted line there, the weighted average. Let's go down a little bit further.
Download?
You can download the data, but we don't need to do that today, so you can take that for yourself. And I should say we also have a separate module. So if you wanted to do an estimate of carbon prices over time, you could download this data into an Excel, and you could input your own carbon prices in an Excel, and it will tell you what the implications would be for an individual project or set of projects.
Cool,
yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah, so that's a separate issue. It's in, I think, analysis or other. We could go look at that in a second if we have time. This is looking at historic emissions for oil, gas, and coal. Again, you can select a production source that you're needed. That you'd like to see.
In this case, is GWP 100 for gas?
Yes.
The one selected above?
Yes, this one is 100.
Okay.
Yeah. And then we go down further, and I'm just conscious of time. I want to get to a couple other things here.
Yeah.
This is a chart that is showing a couple of things. So on the left-hand side, you could see historic production in terms of emissions from oil, gas, and coal. We have to put it in terms of emissions because we need to normalize so you can have all of the different fuels on the same chart. And then as of about 2020, we're projecting the current reserves and how they would fill in the this particular expectation of future production. Okay, and so what this is showing you is you could see that this gray line is filled in all the way out to 2040. What that means is that the oil and the gas in this case are the reserves that exist today are already sufficient to fulfill production expectations through that period. Okay, and in fact would go beyond that. We just don't have it shown here. What that means is it really calls into question the need for new oil and gas based on the particular scenario that was selected here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, a final consideration by your side, because I have a final question for you, then we need to close. If you have something to add here, it's very interesting, but...
Yes, well, this is just showing the biggest fields. So for example, if you wanted to say, what are the most emissions intensive fields in the United Kingdom? This is what they are and the kinds of fossil fuels they produce.
Very interesting. No, my final question is, you have a lot of information available on the use of oil and the reserve of oil.
Yes.
May you have a consideration in terms of the peak of oil? We already achieved the peak of oil or not yet, in your view?
Yeah, well, so the registry doesn't have a view on that. I could tell you the IEA has said we're going to peak all fossil fuels in 2025. You know, I mean, I think we had considered that during COVID that was perhaps the peak, but it looks like we may surpass that. But I think the point is, even from many mainstream forecasters, peak oil is coming relatively soon. So.
Yeah. You know, we know that we are close, more or less, at the peak, but we don't know when exactly will arrive. But for sure, it's the point of years, not the point of decades. For sure.
Yeah, no, that's right. And the scary thing is, even peaking oil means we're not necessarily going fast enough, you know, to meet our climate targets. Yeah,
sure. And also there is implication in terms of cost of oil and a lot of other stuff. Yeah. Okay, a couple of final considerations for everybody. The next corner will be the 11th of November. I will be on Sharm el-Sheikh at the COP27, so will be an update on the COP27. And we will have another event scheduled for the 23rd of November. Is the workshop on the PDR 125, is a national national standard, let me say, for the equity gender. So it will be specific information that is very interesting and is growing in terms of interest on the market. So the time is gone very fast. The tea is finished. So we don't have any more time to continue this very interesting discussion with Rob. Really, thank you for your presentation, and even to give us the opportunity to have a better understanding on the content of the registry. Now we will have the opportunity to go more in deep to have a lot of information for your study. Thank you, Rob, really.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.